Bringing law and order to the Santa Clarita Valley was no easy task in the rough and tumble 19th century. Ideas about crime and punishment changed quite a bit as the valley began to fill up with people. I'm Leon Warden, and this is Legacy, Santa Clarita's Living History. Tonight's guest is no stranger to law and order in the Santa Clarita Valley. He served on the bench for 3 decades in the latter part of the 20th century. I'd like to welcome Adrian Adams to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Now, you arrived in Newhall actually about a year before Frank Sinatra and Sterling Hayden shot the movie Suddenly on San Fernando Road in 1954.
That's correct.
Remember that? Remember seeing it?
I sure do.
Now, your law office was on Market Street.
That is correct.
Did you see it in the movie?
No, it was not.
It wasn't in the
It was
movie. Well, tell me a little bit about, though, seriously, about your background and what it is that made you decide to come out here to Newhall. I understand you were in the FBI?
Yes, I went in the FBI after I finished law school. There's a period of time between taking the bar and when you know that you passed the bar so you can actually practice. Mm-hmm. And I had to have a job. I had quit work to study for the bar. So I applied for the FBI while I was studying for the bar and had a wire from Mr. Hoover, I think 3 days after I finished the bar to report within a week, which I did. And so I went through the FBI Academy and finished that, then was sent to Knoxville. At Knoxville, I learned I passed the bar. So at that time, I decided, well, I'm not sure I'm going to stay with the FBI. It was somewhat like the Army, and I'd spent 3 years in the Army already. And so after I finished about 9 months there, making about a year I was in the FBI, why I resigned and came back here to Los Angeles. And
I guess in the Army you were there in time for Korea.
No, I was there in World War II. I was in infantryman in Europe for a year and a half. Okay. And landed in Marseille, ended up in Munich. So that was my military career, and I couldn't wait to get out.
After the FBI, then, you established a law practice.
Yes, I worked in a firm in 5th and Spring, downtown LA, where I could walk all day and nobody would know I was a lawyer. And that kind of disappointed me because I thought people should know I was a lawyer. Okay. So I decided I'd start looking around for a better place to live where people would know that I had become a lawyer.
So you sought out some place where you wouldn't get lost among the crowds of lawyers.
That's right. That's for sure. And I had learned from a book salesman, a man by the name of Stanley Weissel, had recently passed away here in Newhall and had an office, and of course I meant there was one less lawyer and also an office available with the books, which you always need. So I came out here and looked it over and did end up opening an office here.
Well, regardless of where you practice, don't you have to kind of have a population of people to cull from? I mean, how many people were there in town in 1953?
Well, I estimated there must have been about 10,000 in what you call the Santa Clarita Valley at that time.
And enough of them were causing trouble to need your services?
Well, let's put it this way. I made out. I did make a living, but barely, for quite a while. There was already 2 lawyers in town, Paul Palmer and Art Miller. Art Miller at one time had been a JP here. Right. And he resigned, and Judge McDougall.
Justice of the Peace. Justice
of the Peace. Right. Judge McDougall became his successor. And about all I can say is that we struggled a little bit, but we enjoyed it tremendously. We lived up in Santa Clarita Valley in the up in Benelli tract, and
up in Saugus.
Up in Saugus, right. And eventually things came around. I, of course, joined everything there was you should join. Became a member of the Hart High School Board, which, by the way, at that time the curriculum consisted primarily of agricultural courses.
Sure. Well, describe the valley at that time. I mean, it was mostly ranches.
There really wasn't much to it. There was the homes which Burmite had built, which are still, most of them existing along Walnut Street. Right. And then there was Atwood Addition, which was out toward off of Lyons. Right. And then the Benelli tract. Those were the three areas where people lived. There weren't many people in all of them, but nevertheless they made a nice community. It was self-contained. We had a Safeway store, and we had a Bank of America, right down the street. And by and large, it was a pretty self-contained community. As it gradually, time went on, Thatcher Glass moved in as Burmite faded out. And Thatcher Glass, of course, was a large employer.
Right.
Until they were absorbed by some other company and closed down. And
quite a bit different from the days in Los Angeles. How'd you ever convince your wife to come out to Newhall?
Well, you know, she was raised in the Los Feliz area, which is, you know, is a rather cultivated area, sophisticated area, I suppose you'd put it. And it was a struggle. She went to Pomona, and she hadn't anticipated that she would ever come out to the country like this. But she's a good scout, and her parents were all for me, and that helped. And so we had brought our two children. Well, we only had one child at that time, and moved out here. And she loved it. She still loves it. She wouldn't move anyplace else. Of course, we don't live out in Benelli tract anymore, but in Happy Valley now.
Right. You mentioned McDougall. Now, he was the judge during the 1950s, and he was also the judge when how did it come about that you went in for a judgeship?
Okay. What happened was, of course, first, we were a justice court out here. And then legislature started fooling around with how things were done. And one of the things they ordained was that when a justice court got to a certain size, it could petition, or somebody on its behalf could petition to the Superior Court to become a municipal court.
Okay.
Judge McDougall was not an attorney. He had not even graduated from college.
Yeah, maybe you ought to explain that. I guess you didn't have to be a lawyer to be a judge back in those days.
JPs were not judges, were not attorneys. By and large, there weren't any attorneys out in these small areas. And so Judge McDougall was, as he used to call it, a hamburger merchant. He had a restaurant.
Okay.
And he decided then, when he saw that we could become a municipal court, he decided to go to law school, which he did. And he was in his 40s.
So he's on the bench, and here he is going to law school.
Going to law school. Yeah, I used to ask him, well, how do you, before he went to law school, how do you decide how to rule, whether to sustain an objection or not? He said, well, it was easy. I just alternated back and forth. But he had quite a
I think some people would probably tell you they still do that today, but anyway.
Yeah, Judge McDougall had quite a sense of humor. He used to marry a lot of people because he didn't get paid much. And I remember this was in the time when the men started wearing their hair rather long. And I remember him telling me that in one ceremony he ended up by saying, "Now, one of you kiss the bride."
That's cute.
He had a good sense of humor. But at any rate, he did pass the bar. And as soon as he passed the bar, he had to put in 5 years as a lawyer.
Okay.
Before he could be a municipal court judge.
So he could be a judge, but he couldn't be a municipal court judge.
Right.
Okay.
And so he practiced with me in my office, and finished the 5 years. And I filed a petition with the Superior Court showing that we had sufficient population. Of course, that included the honor ranch. We counted everybody up at the honor ranch.
Kind of fudge the numbers there a little bit. Yeah.
But
isn't it kind of a conflict of interest when the judge is in a law firm? I mean,
well, we weren't partners.
Okay.
We weren't partners. He rented space there, and an attorney by the name of Jim Lauder was also there, and so it was just a space rental thing. We didn't share anything. So once they became municipal court, of course, then we started in trying to figure out how do we get a second judge and when. And the workload was beginning to increase, and at that time, of course, still Newhall land hadn't begun to build,
right.
But they did begin during that 5 year period, and I can remember they began with a tract, you know, right there off of Lyons to begin with. And of course the population then just really began to increase.
Sure.
And before long, we were eligible for a second judge. In fact, Tom Lowe, who was the president of Newhall Land and Farming, was the one who pushed for it.
Okay.
And they did get a second judge, and I was named the second judge. I'd taken a job as a commissioner, by the way, the last couple of years before I became a judge, to help out Judge McDougall because of the load on the court. It was just too much. And so I was appointed by Governor Reagan at that time.
Now this is
1970.
70.
Yeah. Long time ago.
Yeah, up until then, 1970, throughout its history, Newhall had only had one judge at a time.
That's right.
Which kind of seems unusual today since we have, well, 3 judges right now and plus a commissioner when you have one and that kind of thing.
That's right.
So you were the first second judge.
I was the first second judge, right.
You have, I guess, become kind of a self-anointed court historian. You are familiar with some of the ways that justice was handled in these parts back in the, well, back at the turn of the century. What was it like? What kinds of things did judges deal with way back when?
Well, of course, this was a railroad town. It was founded to provide a place for a station. And even at the time I came, catty-cornered from where my office was on Market across from the old courthouse, right along the railroad there was a large building, which was an original building built by the railroad back when they used to have a stop here. So most of the buildings here, or most of the people I should say, were here to service the railroad in some form or another.
Okay.
And almost all the business that the court had at that time dealt with the railroad in one form or another. Most of the time it was people trespassing on the railroad, riding without paying the fare.
Okay. What we used to be able to call hobos and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. They were hobos, right. And that constituted, I'd say, 90% of the court's caseload. And the other 10% was plain drunk on the weekend and that type of thing. Of course, there was a little bit of what they called in the files disorderly houses that were now and then raided.
Professional ladies.
Yeah,
is what we're talking about.
Ladies of the night.
Okay.
But that was not an infrequent one. I remember one.
And that was illegal even back then.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was illegal. I can remember one entry in the docket when the father and the son were both caught at a house out in Acton. I assume it was that age-old story, you know, they tell about the fathers wanting to break their sons in.
Yeah, there you go.
And so the house happened to be raided the night both of them were there.
You have any idea what the punishment was there?
Most of it was $50 and something like that. The alternative was usually a day in jail for each $1. And I remember in one case, the fellow said, "Judge, I'm broke," and didn't change it. In fact, it was Judge Perkins. When the guy pleaded, "Judge, I don't have any money." It was Lewis Klein. I think I have a docket sheet of Lewis Klein's there.
Yeah, here, misdemeanor for Lewis Klein, charged with a misdemeanor for
You know, I'm not sure what I know that's alcohol possession because Lewis Klein operated a still up in Happy Valley, and over in Happy Valley, I should say, and he was quite a frequent. It
was 1929 we're talking
yeah,
about, so just getting into Prohibition here.
Yeah, that's right, Prohibition years, and so a lot of the cases involve that stills.
Yeah.
And
the old Newhall Dry Squad busting up stills.
Yeah, right, exactly. I remember, and some of the things that the judges didn't know what to do with the booze. Of course, they at least they said they didn't know what to do with the booze. I can remember one time why I think it was Art Perkins who ordered them to take it down to the Valley View and told the officers, the constable, whatever they don't use, well, you get rid of in any way you want.
Well, this is Olive View Sanitarium.
Olive View Sanitarium. And I don't know what Olive View would do with the booze. It's all homemade booze, and you know, you wouldn't ever want to treat a patient with anything made homemade like that. But any event, why somehow or another it was carried out.
Yeah.
I've always wondered just how, but nevertheless, why that was the sentence.
Now you mentioned old A.B. Perkins. You knew Perkins.
Oh yes, I knew him.
Now that's kind of interesting. You mentioned laymen being judges. He was he established a water district in Newhall and did a lot of things, but he was also the town historian for many years. Before him, of course, was Judge Powell, who I guess was a sheep rancher.
I don't know much about it. You probably know more than I do about it.
Well, you show his signature here on a document, another one of these court dockets, and it's got the name Tom Mix on it.
That's
now,
right.
What's this one about? It's 1920.
Tom Mix was a famous cowboy actor, and I'm sure everybody sometime in his life has seen the picture of him jumping over the
Beal's Cut.
Beal Cut.
Right.
Now, I assume that's a real photograph. I have no reason to believe it isn't.
It's a real photograph, but how they fabricated it is anybody's guess.
Beal's Cut wasn't always as wide as it is now. It was widened for a tunnel someplace along the way, and I don't know just what year. And that may have been taken before it was ever widened and before they put in the tunnel. But it was a fabulous picture.
Yeah.
But at any rate, Tom
Mix in trouble for here in Newhall.
Oh, he was in trouble for reckless driving.
Wasn't that what he was supposed to be doing in his movies?
Well, he was riding in a movie, not driving.
Well, okay. I know. I've seen pictures of him though, where he would run a car off of the road in Newhall and that sort of thing. So
I suppose it happened. Yeah.
Another one of those $50 fines.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a lot of money in those days, you know.
Well, yeah, you said a day per dollar, so that would have been 50 days in jail if he weren't Tom Mix.
Yeah, unless you were Tom Mix. He could even afford an attorney, which was quite unusual to have an attorney appear out here.
On a reckless driving offense.
On a reckless driving offense.
You know, that's probably a good place to segue into something about driving offenses in general. They had jury trials for that sort of thing back when, didn't they?
They sure did, and they were entitled to a jury, and many people demanded a jury, and that was an extremely expensive proposition for the court. When I first came to town, if somebody wanted a jury trial, well, we didn't as we do now. You know, you have a panel of jurors that you call.
Right.
And they sit there and wait to be called to have a case. But in those days, they didn't ever panel there. What they would do instead was start walking down the street.
Okay.
And pick up 12 good citizens. So what it amounted to, and the constable in those days would ask them kindly to step over to the courthouse with him and hear a case.
I guess these weren't the same good citizens who were getting in trouble a few years earlier on public drunk.
I trust not, although I don't know. But at any rate, that was the way they picked a jury. I remember they did that with the first case I tried even in court. And it was a shock to me because I was used to trying cases in Los Angeles where they'd have a panel come in, you know, with all kinds of extra people there you could ask questions of. Well, you couldn't, when they had 12 people sitting there, you couldn't ask many questions because there wasn't anybody else to call on if you didn't want them on the jury.
You were stuck with the 12 that you got.
You were stuck with the 12 you got.
Okay.
And they were pretty professional. Most of them have been on the jury innumerable times, the local butcher and so forth.
Waiting to be swept off the street. Okay.
That's the way it was done.
Now, with traffic tickets, though, they had a jury for a traffic ticket.
Yeah, they had a jury for a traffic ticket. We began to, as we grew, of course, after I was on the bench, we had to call a panel in because we had so many traffic tickets. This area with two major freeways going through it has a tremendous volume of traffic tickets. And we would call in a panel, and we'd have as many as 3 jury trials going at the same time. Because
in one little building?
In one little building. We'd have one in the jury room, one sitting in the jury room, one sitting in the judge's chambers, and one maybe just sitting in the corner of the courthouse, you know, the courtroom. As soon as one would get done, why, say it was a jury room, we'd bring them in and we'd move the other one into the jury room. And they didn't, it was interesting because I don't know how much it was deliberate or not, but they didn't deliberate very long in the jury room. One of the reasons being they had neither water nor a bathroom.
Okay.
And so
it makes a quick decision.
They made quick decisions. And you know, in historical times, back in the days of common law in England, that was the rule. The jury got neither food nor water until they reached a verdict.
Really?
But in our day, we're a little more civilized, and so we would allow them, if they wanted water, we would allow them to go out and have a drink of water. We'd have to send the bailiff to accompany them to it. But it took a good deal of courage for a lady to ask to go to the bathroom if she was sitting in there, because she would have to be accompanied by the bailiff to the bathroom, and he'd have to stand outside and wait for her and then trail her back in.
With everybody watching it.
With everybody watching and knowing what was going on, of course. But at any rate, it was kind of a system we worked out. Finally, through the efforts of Antonovich, Supervisor Antonovich, that was solved. I happened to be having lunch with him one day at Newhall Land and Farming. And I mentioned to him I just finished a 2-day trial, not over a traffic ticket, but over I don't know what they call it, you know, where they ride those little things on the lake and would have sails.
Well, some kind of a boating.
Yeah, it's a little, it's not a boat, but it's a surfboard with a sail on it, is what it
okay.
amounts to.
Okay.
Well, it's not, they have places posted where you cannot land with those up there at the lake because of the danger to people swimming.
Okay.
Well, he landed in an area that was forbidden, and he was given a ticket. And he was cited in court and asked for a jury trial. Well, you know, that's not really a serious offense. I mean, you're not going to put a person in jail over that, so it hardly warrants a jury trial, but he had his right to a jury trial. Took 2 days of a court's time to hear that jury trial. So I mentioned that to Antonovich and suggested to him he might consider legislation reducing those to an infraction, which the county could do.
Right.
With an infraction, like a traffic ticket is today, you can pay a fine, but you cannot be put in jail. And he thought it sounded like a pretty good idea. He convinced the Board of Supervisors, and all of they changed a number of violations to infractions.
Unclogged the court system.
Unclogged
out of
it.
a conversation over lunch.
It really did.
There you
It
go.
inhibited the judges somewhat because we used to, Judge Clark and I at the time, Judge Jack Clark was sitting with me. Judge McDougall had retired. And people speeding over 100 miles an hour, we used to give them a day in jail.
Right.
And we'd send them in there to sit with the hard criminals and awaiting their appearance.
Right.
And we'd usually let them go at the end of the day. We wouldn't make them go downtown. But we'd let them go, but they'd sit for a day in jail there with those fellows and hoping that it would be helpful. We couldn't do that anymore, and so it kind of inhibited us a little bit, but nevertheless, I think it was a good idea.
Yeah. Now, you know, we're going to be out of time quicker than you know. So
Okay.
why don't you tell me a little bit about the courtroom here that was on Market Street?
Okay.
Tell me about why does the jury panel look like it does there with
Well, these are my relatives sitting up here, actually, my
Okay.
2 children, and this is I'm being zipped up with my robe. And this is the jury panel, and you'll notice an interesting thing about the jury, they had no skirt rail.
Right.
And somehow or another, my bailiff always managed to get the good-looking girls in those days of short skirts sitting in the front row. Now, I don't know how I managed to do that, but they seemed to pull the names out of the hat that way.
Happened, yeah.
Time
Name
after
out of the
time.
hat. Time after time. Nobody ever figured it out.
No.
You have a couple other pictures here. One is a groundbreaking at the hospital.
Yes,
Now, what was your involvement with the hospital?
Okay, I was the first chairman of the board there at the hospital. The Newhall Land and Farming gave $1 million and 25 acres of land to us to start a hospital. And I was chairman of the board, first board we had. And we started out at Hillside, that's out in Saugus area, and started out our hospital there and then moved it as soon as the building was
The Golden
completed.
Triangle area.
Yeah, Golden Triangle area. And as soon as the building was completed, of course, we moved it in here. And I was chairman of the board for, I think, 8 years, and then I stepped down. I thought that was long enough that somebody else should take over.
Now, you were on the bench from 1970 to, well, you were in Newhall from 1953, on the bench in 1970, and then you served up until 1991, right? CHP.
Right, that stands out the most to me, because right after I had been inducted, we had the 4 highway patrolmen killed out there by a couple of fellows who were just, I don't know what was wrong with them, but at any rate, they killed 4 of them.
Out of what is today Marie Callender's.
That is right. They're where Marie Callender's is today. And I heard the preliminary hearing here in Newhall. And that was, I think, the most horrifying experience I ever had as far as hearing the evidence on what those men did. It's hard to believe that men could act like that. But
so you were actually personally involved in that?
I sure was. Very personally. Of course, we didn't hear the trial. The trial was held down in Superior Court.
Sure. Well, I don't want to end on a sad note, but we do have to bring it to a close.
Okay.
So I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure.
And for answers to all your SCV history questions, and for more information about the Newhall incident that we were just talking about, visit scvhistory.com on the internet or stop by the Saugus train station in downtown Newhall weekends 1 to 4. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Legacy, Santa Clarita's Living History. I'm Leon Warden. Good night.